Hello everyone and welcome on into SportsBird. My name is Dylan Bird, the founder of this YouTube channel. So just to give everyone a quick background of myself, as this is my first video, I've been creating content for a few years now. I have my website sportsbird.com, and I just graduated college, so I have a lot of time on my hands, so I decided that I would bring back sportsbird.com, but in conjunction with this YouTube channel, SportsBird, and kind of just created a blend of different kinds of content, written, video, audio, and I'm going to be creating weekly fantasy content every single week, fantasy football. Once basketball season rolls around next season, I'm sure I'll have fantasy basketball content then. Also, sports betting is going to be a big focus of this channel. On Fridays, I will be giving away my college football picks for the weekend. Last weekend had a great weekend, college football betting. It was great to see college football back. As I went to Penn State, I am a huge college football fan. And look, it's looking like we could get the Big Ten announced back today, so I'm really, really excited for that. And now to get into this topic of this video, which is Week 2 waiver wire advice for fantasy football. Week 1 of the NFL season was amazing. It was great to see football back. Great to feel a sense of normalcy during this, whole pandemic. Everything's felt so bizarre. The NFL was normal. We had a Thursday night game, we had a whole Sunday slate, and then we had 2 Monday night games in the opener last night. And to get started on this video topic, we are going to talk about Week 2 waiver wire advice for fantasy football. And here's how it's going to work. We're going to go through running backs, we're going to go through wide receivers, and we're going to go through tight ends. I'm going to talk about players in those positions that you should target and players that you should stay away from. And I'll give you a few stats to back up why. And I'm really, really excited. I'm going to be doing this type of video every single Tuesday, waiver wire advice. Be sure to subscribe to this channel, like this video to help it. Let me know if your feedback helps you as well. I'm really, really looking forward to this. And, it's going to be interesting. Before I create a finalized content schedule, I'm going to pretty much see what works and go with it. But this is one thing that I'm going to keep every single week. Tuesday morning waiver wire advice. Here it is. So, my first piece of advice on the waiver wire this week is do not overreact to the Week 1 results. Week 1 is always bizarre in the NFL, in fantasy football. You don't know if these results are going to hold through the rest of the season, through the next few weeks. It's Week 1. It's one game. There's not much to this. But there is a little bit to it. You got to get that mixture, that blend. But if you are in a free agent auction league where you have a sum of money that you could spend all throughout the year, you know that when your team is in most need, coming down to the stretch where you're trying to make the playoffs in Week 10, Week 11, that is when you're going to want to save your money for, because you know that there's going to be the running back that gets hurt or the 2 running backs that get hurt, and you need to pick up that third string guy in Week 10 or Week 11. So you need to make sure that you're saving the proper amount. Do not overspend based on one performance on Week 1. Yes, you should look at the waiver wire. Yes, you should make pickups. Should you overspend? No. Should you be devastated if you don't get the guy you want? Absolutely not. Just to give you an idea of why I'm saying all this and, just some stats to back it up. Let's look at 2019, last year, Week 1, some players that went absolutely off Week 1. Philip Dorsett, who was on the New England Patriots at the time, 4 receptions, 95 yards, and 2 touchdowns last year, Week 1. Then we had Danny Amendola, 7 receptions, 104 yards, and 1 touchdown. And then we had John Ross, who had 7 receptions, 158 yards, and 2 touchdowns. So just what is in common about those 3 guys is that crazy Week 1, and we're pretty much fantasy irrelevant for the entire rest of the season. But now you look at a guy like DJ Chark last year, who had 4 receptions for 146 yards and 1 touchdown, and that was a guy that if you had picked up Week 1, then you would have benefited tremendously throughout the rest of the season, especially those next few weeks leading up after Week 1. So, I'm going to try and help you differentiate between guys that are flukes Week 1 and guys that you should actually give a strong look at and pick up. Starting with the running backs, we have my number 1 running back pickup of the week, Malcolm Brown, running back of the Los Angeles Rams. Look, I think everyone thought that Cam Akers was going to be the back in LA for the Rams. McVay constantly said he's going to run a committee, and it pretty much seemed that Malcolm Brown was the number 1 running back for the Rams this week. Only 7.9% owned in ESPN. All my percentages ownership, I'm going to go by ESPN because I just happen to have the most leagues in ESPN, but 7.9 ownership only, ESPN, And just to look at some of Malcolm Brown's stats this week, he had a 60% snap share compared to Cam Akers getting 33%, Darrell Henderson getting only 7%. So, I mean, definitely McVay seems to be preferring Malcolm Brown over Cam Akers, at least early in week 1. However, I do expect Akers' role to slowly increase as the season goes on, but if Malcolm Brown looks that good throughout the entire season, it's going to be tough for him to lose that job. I mean, he looked phenomenal. He had 18 carries, 79 yards, 2 touchdowns on the ground, 3 receptions, 31 yards on 4 targets through the air. Look, I think Malcolm Brown is the number 1 guy to pick up. He's number 1 in my opinion because in an offense like McVay's where you saw the running back, Todd Gurley, in 2018 thrive just so much, I think that if Malcolm Brown gets, continuous touches every single week, if he continues to prove that he could be the guy, he could end up being a running back 2 or 3 in fantasy football if he could keep that starting job. I mean, the only threat is Cam Akers, which is a little bit scary because he's a rookie, but Cam Akers did not look anywhere near as good as Malcolm Brown. As I said, I know it's only week 1, but Cam Akers, 14 carries, 39 yards, and then only had 1 catch. So he, got 4 less carries than Malcolm Brown, who was at 18, but Brown looked like the superior back by far, and I expect Brown to keep his job over Akers for the foreseeable future. Now, barely coming in at number 2, could have been number 1, honestly, would maybe even consider it a 1A and 1B between these two guys, is Nyheim Hines of the Indianapolis Colts. So I think it's so funny because everyone was so high on Jonathan Taylor, didn't really know, is Marlon Mack going to steal carries from Taylor? Like, what's going to be the deal? And next thing you know, Nyheim Hines is the guy to score the first touchdown of the season for the Indianapolis Colts. And not only the first touchdown of the season from running backs, he also scored 2 touchdowns in the game. So Nyheim Hines, he had the highest snap count out of any of the running backs. As we know, Marlon Mack did go down with an Achilles injury, which helps Nyheim Hines' long-term snap count, also helps Jonathan Taylor. But I do think that while Jonathan Taylor is going to be confirmed, is the confirmed starting running back according to Frank Reich, I do think that Nyheim Hines is going to play a massive role in this back. It seems like Indianapolis loves him. They, as I said, they gave him 53% of the snap count compared to Taylor 35, Marlon Mack 15. Nyheim Hines, he also had a 17.3% target share. He had 8 targets. He had 8 for 45 and 1 touchdown receiving, and then 7 for 28 and 1 rushing and 1 touchdown rushing. Whereas a guy like Taylor, he had 6 receptions, 67 yards receiving, and then 9 carries for 22 yards rushing. So I do think that Taylor is probably going to have a little bit more carries than Nyheim Hines going forward each week. However, I really like Hines in terms of a PPR league. I think he's going to get a ton of catches each week. 17.3% target share this week, which is absolutely great. And in ESPN leagues right now, he's only 36.7% owned, so be sure to grab him. Now, my third pickup of the week in terms of running backs is Jacksonville Jaguars starting running back James Robinson. ESPN, he's only going for 29.1% owned right now. He had a 68% snap share this week, and he looked damn good as he had 16 carries, 62 yards, didn't score, but he also had a reception for 28. I wish that all these Jaguars running backs had gone either injured or on the COVID list a little bit earlier, because then I could have hopped right on the James Robinson train before the season even started. I would have been sure to pick him up in a few leagues, but James Robinson is the guy. And if you look at his stats in college, in his senior year at Illinois State, he had 364 carries for 1,899 yards and 18 touchdowns. I mean, there's no doubt that this guy could handle a strong workload, and I think that it seems like Doug Marrone really, really trusts Robinson early, so as long as those running backs are not there, I expect Robinson to be a really, really solid play as long as he's getting the touches. Now, we have a little bit of a drop-off here, but if we're looking at 2 other guys in terms of running backs that I would look at picking up if you cannot get one of those top 3, it would be Joshua Kelley of the Los Angeles Chargers, and it would be Benny Snell of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, looking at Joshua Kelley, only 11.3% owned in ESPN leagues, only had a 24% snap share, which is slightly concerning, but he did make the most of it. He had 12 carries for 60 yards and a touchdown. Now, if you compare that to Austin Eckler had 19 carries for 84 yards and no touchdowns. Here's why I was concerned about Austin Eckler going into the season is because the Chargers always seem to want to use a complement to Eckler. They want to use a guy who could, pound the ball on the ground, and they want to use Eckler as maybe a little bit more of a pass-catching back. Now, it's ironic because Eckler did not even have a reception this week. He wasn't really targeted at all in the passing game. He did have 19 carries, but I thought it was extremely interesting for a rookie like Kelley to go in there and get 12 carries, 60 yards, and a touchdown. He's somebody I would look at in deeper leagues for sure. And then looking at Benny Snell, really, really disappointing night for James Conner, as I own in one of my leagues. I expected big things from Conner this year, and I honestly still do, but he went down with a sprained ankle early in the Steelers game, and given Conner's injury history, the Steelers kind of just kept him sidelined the rest of the game, and that led to Benny Snell, who looked extremely fast, a lot faster than he looked when he destroyed Penn State in the Citrus Bowl. Broke my heart. Kentucky beat Penn State. Benny Snell went off, but looks like he got a lot faster, and looks in really, really good shape. Had 19 carries for 113 yards. Didn't get into the end zone, but it was really, really convincing for Benny Snell. If Conner continues to be hurt, Conner only had 6 carries for 9 yards. He pretty much played the first couple of drives and then got hurt. Benny Snell could be a really, really good option while Conner's out, but the thing is that after the game ended last night, they did announce that they don't expect Conner to be out for long, and I don't see this team moving away from Conner right away, as long as he can get back on the field soon. But, Benny Snell is only owned 14.6% in ESPN leagues. Low ownership, I'm sure, pretty much across the board in different leagues, so I would be sure to pick him up if you're in a deep league, especially if you have James Conner. You got to get this guy, because if Conner's going to be out, just like multiple Steeler running backs in the past, when Bell was out, you had guys like D'Angelo Williams who used to go absolutely off. I have a feeling that it could be the same case here with James Conner and Benny Snell. If you own James Conner, you need to make sure you get Benny Snell. Now, 2 guys who had pretty decent weeks that are running backs that I would definitely stay away from is Peyton Barber, running back of the Washington football team, and Adrian Peterson, running back of the Detroit Lions. So to start with Peyton Barber, only 1.3% owned in ESPN leagues. Did have a 41% snap share compared to J.D. McKissick, who had just higher at 44%, and Antonio Gibson, who had lower at 26%. Here's why I'm low on Barber. He did have the 2 touchdowns. He got 2 one-yard touchdowns. He only had 29 yards on 17 carries. Obviously, less than 2 yards a carry, not ideal. You had a guy like Antonio Gibson who had 9 carries for 36 yards, averaging 4 yards a carry. As Gibson, gets more acclimated to the offense, you have to keep in mind, Gibson is a guy who only had 33 carries at running back at Memphis in college. He's a guy that's going to take a little bit long to develop. They're going to wait for him to get acclimated in the offense before they toss him in there. So they're probably going to limit Gibson's carries early, but the question is that Peyton Barber is not going to be valuable for that much longer, and simply because he's just not very good. And I mean, one interesting thing that I have Gibson in a few of my leagues, so I was watching this game closely, watching the touches closely, and they actually had Antonio Gibson in the game during the first time they had they were at the 1 yard line. They had him rush and he got stuffed, and then they threw Peyton Barber in the rest of the game. I do expect Gibson to start getting a lot more of these goal line carries once the season goes on. I'm not very big at Peyton Barber at all. Leave him for others on the waiver wire. Don't pick him up. Now, in terms of Adrian Peterson, one of the most interesting cases, he was on Washington. He got picked up by Detroit like a week ago, and he gets most of the carries, but not most of the snap share. And he had 14 carries for 93 yards, 3 receptions for 21 yards. But DeAndre Swift actually held the most in terms of snap share, the 3 running backs at 44%. Adrian Peterson was down at 31% for snap share, and Kerryon Johnson was at 26%. Kerryon only had 7 carries for 14 yards. Swift only had 3 carries for 15 compared to Peterson's 14 for 93, as I had said before. But the truth is that I think Detroit's just basically going to slowly bring on Swift. I don't think that Peterson's going to be used every week. I also don't know if Peterson at his age is going to hold up injury-wise throughout the entire season. And look, if Swift can catch that ball at the end of the game to win Detroit the game, he has 2 touchdowns, and he has a really, really solid fantasy day despite not getting a lot of touches. DeAndre Swift is talented. He was my, top running back in terms of the NFL draft, this past year. I think Swift is going to be really good. I think it's going to take a few weeks. So I think Peterson is probably going to get a lot of carries the next few weeks, but I don't foresee him being a long-term fantasy option at all. So I stay away from Peterson. All right, now moving on to wide receivers. wide receivers is definitely tougher than running backs to pick up. I mean, one guy could go off any week. Any wide receiver could go off any week. So that's why it's tough to pinpoint who's going to be the DJ Chark, as I said before, and who's going to be the John Ross or Philip Dorsett, who doesn't really do anything the rest of the year. Well, two guys who are pretty highly owned in fantasy, but not as high owned as they should be. Robbie Anderson and Darius Slayton, if they are available in your league, whether maybe you're in a 10-man league where one of these guys is luckily not rostered, you need to pick him up. Robbie Anderson, I'm not going to spend much time here because I think this is pretty obvious. Robbie Anderson, 6 receptions, 115 yards, and a touchdown on 8 targets, 23.5% target share for Carolina. I honestly think that people were way too low on Robbie Anderson. He was extremely talented with the Jets, speedy receiver, deep threat in this new Joe Brady offense. I understand the thought that there is DJ Moore there. Bridgewater's not the type of guy to throw deep, but Robbie is super talented, and they're going to find ways to get this guy the ball. Robbie Anderson is a better wide receiver than Curtis Samuel. So if Robbie continues to play like this, he's going to be the clear wide receiver number 2 in Carolina. Very worthy of a fantasy pickup if he's available in your league. Moving on, we have Darius Slayton, another guy who again is very, very highly owned. But if if you got lucky and he may be available in a 10-man league, pick him up. I understand that Golden Tate was out, and that's when Slayton thrived last year, and he thrived again with Tate out this time. Slayton, six receptions, 102 yards and 2 touchdowns on 9 targets, 23.1% of the target share. I love Slayton. I think even when Tate comes back, Slayton is going to be extremely productive. So if those guys are available, you need to pick them up. Now, looking at guys that are, available in most leagues compared to not available in most leagues, my number 1 wide receiver pickup of the week is Parris Campbell of the Indianapolis Colts. So Parris Campbell, only 29.8% owned in ESPN leagues. 6 receptions, 71 yards, didn't score. Against Jacksonville this week, he had 9 targets, which was tied for first with T.Y. Hilton on the team. 19.5% target share. I think that it was a huge question who was going to be the wide receiver 2 in Indy. Was it going to be the rookie Michael Pittman? Was it going to be Parris Campbell? It looks pretty clear that Rivers does like Parris Campbell a lot. I think that if Parris Campbell continues to be the wide receiver 2 over Michael Pittman, I think he's going to be extremely valuable in fantasy this year. So pick him up if he's available on your waiver wire. Now, moving on to what was the most interesting performance of last night, in my opinion, Monday night, we had Corey Davis. Corey Davis, former number 5 overall pick, was an extremely talented receiver out of Western Michigan, and he is this is currently his 4th NFL season. He has not done anything in his first 3. People have been waiting for the guy to break out, and he just hasn't yet. But last night, Tannehill absolutely loved him. 7 receptions, 101 yards, didn't score, but he had 8 targets, 20% of the target share. Only 3.9% owned in ESPN leagues. If he can stay this consistent, then he's going to be a viable fantasy option. I mean, he got 8 targets last night. Tannehill seemed to love him. I think that this could be possibly his breakout year. I saw Matthew Berry comparing him to possibly a Devontae Parker, a guy who didn't work out his first 3 years and then had a huge season in his 4th. Could happen. I would definitely take a look at him on the waiver wire this week. Now, looking at another guy. Now, my third guy here. You have a guy that is a rookie. He's on what's going to be a bad team, so it could be a little bit risky, but I'm going to take the risk here, and I'm going to say Laviska Shenault from Jacksonville. Only 7.7% owned in ESPN leagues. Had himself a day with 3 catches for 37 yards and a touchdown on just 4 targets, but it was 20% of the target share because Jacksonville only threw the ball 20 times in this game. They didn't really need to throw it that much, and that's just the truth. I do think that in a lot of other games, they're going to be down a lot of points, and they're going to need to throw the football, and I think Laviska Shenault is going to be that wide receiver number 2 next to DJ Chark. Now, I think that Laviska Shenault, just the way he plays, he could be this year's Deebo Samuel, a guy who's going to be extremely consistent. He may not pop off for 30 in a week one time, but I think he's going to be consistent 10 to 15 points in leagues at some point during the season, just because Jacksonville is going to have to throw more than 20 times. That's going to happen, and to see Laviska get 20% of the target share, and And also, Jacksonville was using him creatively. They gave him 2 carries for 10 yards. So I think, and he even played Wildcat QB. So I think Laviska Shenault is going to be used really creatively. I think he's going to be very good. He would have been a first-round pick had he been able to stay healthy in college. He missed a ton of games in college, but he was a beast when he played. And I think he's going to be really, really good this year. And in terms of another guy I look at, my 4th guy here, we have Anthony Miller, wide receiver, Chicago Bears. A lot higher owned than a guy like Laviska Shenault and a guy like Corey Davis. Miller is 37.9% owned in ESPN leagues. He went for 4 receptions for 76 yards and a touchdown on 6 targets, 16.7% of the target share against the Detroit Lions. Now, for whatever reason, Anthony Miller seems to absolutely love destroying the Lions. I mean, if you remember last year on Thanksgiving, Anthony Miller had 9 receptions for 140 yards against Detroit. So I would hesitate a little bit here. If Miller could finally, break out in that year 3, if Trubisky is good and Miller could be that reliable number 2 wide receiver for Chicago, then I think that Miller could be a viable fantasy option. We're going to have to see, though. The reason I'm pausing a lot more on Miller is because he was playing Detroit, who doesn't have a great secondary at all, so we'll have to see on him. My next 2 guys, these are guys I would only target if I am in very, very deep leagues. We have Scotty Miller, wide receiver, Tampa Bay Bucks, and Russell Gage, wide receiver, Atlanta Falcons. Now, in terms of Scotty Miller, only 5.2% owned in ESPN leagues. He is the 3rd receiver on the Tampa Bay Bucks. He had 5 receptions for 73 yards on 6 targets, 17.6% of the target share in Tampa Bay. I think a lot of this could have to do with Mike Evans being, kind of used as a decoy as he was injured with that hamstring. So, again, if you're in a very, very deep league, then I'd pick up Scotty Miller because guess what? If Evans or Godwin gets hurt, then Scotty Miller is going to be a commodity on the waiver wire if he's still there. So I'd pick him up right now. I still think that Miller could be solid even with Godwin and Evans there. So we'll have to see. But remember what happened with Brashad Perryman last year when Evans and Godwin got hurt. Perryman was an absolute tank. Led him to getting a pretty decent contract from the Jets, and he's supposed to be the number 1 wide receiver there now. So we will see what happens with Perryman, but I think Scotty Miller could play that Perryman role at some point during the season where he goes off during a span that receivers may be hurt, or even if they're playing, Scotty Miller is a nice 3rd option for Tom Brady, and I think that in deeper leagues he's worthy of a waiver look. Now, in terms of Russell Gage, he's pretty much the same way as Scotty Miller. He's the 3rd wide receiver in a crowded wide receiver room. Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley, only 4% owned on ESPN is Russell Gage. And he had 9 catches for 114 yards on 12 targets, which was 23% of the target share in Atlanta. And look at Russell Gage's 6 games, last 6 games last season. 32 receptions, 289 yards, and a touchdown on 48 targets. Ridley was out for 3 of those games. And again, like Scotty Miller, I think that if Julio Jones or Calvin Ridley gets hurt, Russell Gage will be a really, really nice option. Now, obviously, Matt Ryan threw for over 500 yards. Atlanta was down the whole game, so they were throwing a ton. And that's one of the reasons why Gage's stats are so high this week. So don't rush to pick up Gage. But if you're in a very deep league, he could be worthy of a look. If one of those receivers gets hurt, Gage is going to be a great option down the stretch. Now, you may be wondering, I did not mention any of the Green Bay guys to pick up, Lazard or Valdes-Scantling. Honestly, I'm not that high on Green Bay. On those Green Bay receivers, I should say. I think it's going to be a weekly thing where, one guy may do well one week, another guy may do well another week. I don't think it's going to be a pretty set thing with one guy being the number 2, like the set number 2, the guy who produces next to Devontae Adams. Also, you have to look at Green Bay, who scored 43 points this week. I don't think that's going to happen maybe again this entire season. So pump the brakes on the Green Bay guys. I'm not huge on them. I look at one of the guys that I mentioned rather than those guys. So not huge on Green Bay guys, but we're going to move to tight ends now. Tight ends, you got to look at Dallas Goedert. Very obviously had, the best week of any tight end pretty much this week. Or at least one of them. I know Noah Fant had another huge night last night. But yeah, Goedert had 8 receptions, 101 yards, and a touchdown. He's only 27.2% owned in ESPN leagues. Goedert also had 9 targets, 21.4% of the target share. with the Eagles being so thin at wide receiver, they are looking for other receiving options. It's one of the reasons I loved Ertz going into this year, but they are going to go with 2 tight end sets in Philly, and I think Goedert should have a really, really solid year. Could even be, this could be the first time in a while that we've seen 2 tight ends from the same team ranking in the top 10 of fantasy players, probably since like Gronk and Aaron Hernandez, when they were both top 10 tight ends for New England. I think that Philly is going to use both Goedert and Ertz a ton. They pretty much showed it this week. I think that Wentz is going to be looking for guys who he could target, with being very thin at wide receiver. Alshon Jeffrey's out for at least the first few games. You have Jalen Reagor, who he is a rookie. I mean, he's very talented. I think Reagor is going to end up being a good player, but he is a rookie. And then you have Deshaun Jackson, who, again, he's a hit-miss type guy. I think that Goedert is an extremely reliable target, could be a starting type tight end in fantasy football this year. Now, 3 other tight ends that I'm looking at, who, again, only pick them up if you're in very deep leagues and you're very needy of a tight end. Maybe if you have George Kittle, he got hurt, you got to pick up another guy. 3 guys I'm looking at: O.J. Howard, tight end, Tampa Bay Bucks; Logan Thomas, tight ends, Washington Football Team; Jimmy Graham, tight ends, Chicago Bears. Looking at O.J. Howard, only 4.9% owned in ESPN leagues. He had 4 catches, 36 yards, and a touchdown on 6 targets, 17.6% target share. I have been pumping the brakes on Rob Gronkowski this entire offseason. I think he's pretty much there as a decoy. I don't think he's going to be much involved at all. He's there because Brady is there, and that's the truth. I don't think that Gronk is what he was. I don't trust Gronk to hold up in terms of injuries. So I think that O.J. Howard may end up being the better tight end in Tampa. And, I mean, he showed it this week. He did have 6 targets. He did have 17.6% of the share. Gronk pretty much did nothing. He had 2 catches, I believe, for just over 10 yards. So I think O.J. Howard could be a nice option down later in the season. We know Brady does love to use the tight end, so we'll see what happens there. Now, one of the most interesting people that I looked at in terms of stat lines this week was Logan Thomas. Logan Thomas, only 0.6% owned in ESPN leagues. Washington Football Team's starting tight ends. He was actually a former quarterback in college. He was Virginia Tech's quarterback, converted to tight end once the quarterbacking did not work out for him in the NFL. He had 4 receptions, 37 yards, and a touchdown on 8 targets, which led the team. He also had 26.7% target share. Again, I pumped the brakes a little bit on Logan Thomas because it's Washington. They're not going to be good, probably. You don't really know with them. You don't really know with Dwayne Haskins at QB what's going to happen, but Haskins seemed to love him. I mean, he led the team in targets, Logan Thomas. Definitely keep your eye on him. If not, if you don't pick him up this week, keep your eye on how he does in week 2, maybe pick him up after week 2. But Logan Thomas, flag him for now. Now, another guy I'm looking at is Jimmy Graham. I didn't love Jimmy Graham going into the season. He hasn't been good for a number of years now, but he did have 3 receptions for 25 yards and a touchdown on 7 targets, 19.4% target share. Graham is worth mentioning. If Trubisky is what he was in 2018 this year, then maybe Graham will be a decent option in fantasy. I'm not I'm a lot more interested in Howard and Thomas than Graham for a number of reasons, but Graham is definitely worth a flag right now. If you need to plug in a tight end for next week, maybe Jimmy Graham could be an option for you. If you have Kittle and Kittle got hurt and you got to plug in a guy. So that is all we got for week 2 waiver wire advice. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, like this video, really helps me out a lot. Feel free to reach out to me on Twitter at sports_bird. My name is Dylan Bird, and I am looking forward to helping out everybody in fantasy football this year and helping everyone out in sports betting. Like I said, I will have my college football picks on a video coming out on Friday. I will have my week 2 fantasy football rankings out tomorrow or Thursday. Probably going to be tomorrow, but we'll have to see. Like I said, since I'm just starting up, the content schedule is not finalized yet. I'm going to have to see what happens, each week and go from there. But, I'm going to try to do as much as possible to help everyone out. And like I said, feel free to reach out to me anytime. If you have any trade questions, visit sportsbird.com, which is my website. There is a fantasy football trade analyzer on there. and you submit a trade, you submit your email, and I will get back to you as soon as possible with my response. Analyzing your trade. I will let you know if you won the trade. You put in a bunch of details so I know details about your team and I could therefore evaluate it. I'm looking really, really forward again to just getting started with all this. So thank you for watching this. If you watched, be sure to subscribe, be sure to like the video, and see you guys tomorrow.